Oh, so the program's open?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Lee, the president of the China Society of Southern California. This program is a joint presentation by the China Society of Southern California, the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and the Textile Museum Associates. I think what we're trying to do with this program is quite a bit different from our normal China Society meetings. Most of our China Society programs have been single programs on a topic. Because we're associated with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, a while back, we changed the format of our programs. Originally, we were going to have just two programs by David, one on the identification of birds and animals in rank badges, and the second on the evolution of the designs of Chinese rank badges. A couple of months ago, the Historical Society had a cancellation in their program. And so I had David scheduled to give a talk, and I was thinking, how can we make his talk a program that would be of interest to both our groups, something that was more historical. So I asked David, and he said, well, yeah, he could make it more historical. He could talk, instead of just on rank badges, he could talk on the examination process of how people became mandarins. And I was really happy with this. And so we had this first program on the examination process, and it was an eye-opener for me. It's something that I hadn't been aware of, and it was something that I think was of interest to both the China Society and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. Following that, I thought we would do the identification of the birds and animals in the rank badges, and that turned out real well. Both of these programs you can see on YouTube. You can go to China Society of Southern California YouTube, and both of these programs will come up. I think we've expanded what was supposed to be our third part of this program into a much broader program, one that takes a little more time. And that was in part because I had seen a program that David had done for Christie's, and I think that was earlier last year. And it ran for, I think, 2 hours. And I was thinking, gee, David, you know, the first part of your program is wonderful, but people who collect rank badges seem to want badges, seem to be able to get badges of the late Qing period. And maybe you could have less on the early badges and more on the late badges. And he said, well, yeah, why don't we have 2 programs instead of 1 on this? And then the Textile Museum Associates became a co-sponsor, and they're very interested in textiles, and I'm sure many of them probably collect rank badges, but also probably collect the rank badges that are more available, those of the late Qing period. So I was talking to David about, oh, well, you know, expand the whole thing, don't cut out the early part. and put more on the later part. So a couple of days ago, he said, I have an awful lot of slides. Can we do it in 3 programs? So we are going to be doing 3 programs on the design evolution of Chinese rank badges. And maybe this will confuse some of you people. Maybe you will have questions that probably would be more related to the 3rd portion of this program rather than the program we're doing today. But I think have patience, and I think we're going to really have a very interesting, very intense study of Chinese rank badges. I guess I should introduce David for those of you who hadn't come to his earlier 2 lectures. I've known David for maybe 30 years. He was a friend of my neighbor, Gim Fong, and Gim introduced me and him, I guess, to better rank badges. And I think David has been an exceptional collector of rank badges in that he, like some very, very few collectors, tend to want to learn everything about rank badges and everything associated with rank badges, and to actually become a fountain of knowledge for this this subject. So I think without further ado, I'd like to oh, and I guess I should say that a couple hours ago I finally got my copy of his book, and I have been fascinated with the book. It has a lot more than rank badges, and it has almost everything that I would want to know about rank badges, but also about the Chinese history. And I think it's a wonderful book. So anyway, without further ado, we'll let David start his program on the design evolution of rank badges.
Thank you, Bob. As always, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to people who are interested in something that I'm very passionate about. And I appreciate the China Society of Southern California, the Historical Society, and the Museum Associates for sponsoring this presentation. Let me talk just a little bit about my history with rank badges. In particular, the specification of the evolution of rank badges has not really been studied very extensively. When I first started collecting about 30 years ago, badges were either identified by century or whether or not they came from the Kangxi or Qinlong range, both of which were 60 years in duration. And so the degree of specificity of the evolution was clearly at a very rudimentary point. The thing that I find a little uncomfortable is that currently I'm the only one trying to be more exact about the evolution and publishing my conclusions. The problem that gives me is that there's no one to really trade ideas with and bounce ideas off, question a particular decision or thing. So what I'm doing tonight is offering the insights that I've gained without claiming that they're perfect, but I am confident I'm being more accurate than just getting the century correct. The Ming Dynasty was the first dynasty to require the wear of rank badges. The court regulations were published initially in 1391, 28 years after the Ming Dynasty had been founded. But all through the rest of the Ming Dynasty and all of the Qing Dynasty, rank badges were used to denote the locations of officials within the imperial bureaucracy. Some general comments about Ming badges. And one of the difficulties that people have had, and I have, is that the accuracy of your dating, your ability to appropriately sequence the badges depends on the number of examples that are available. And since Ming Badges are all over 400 years old, the badges are very rare. Most of the badges come from very late in the dynasty, and many are dragon badges, which I find notoriously difficult to date because the dragons are so dominant within the badge that there's very little room for iconography that I use to try and date rank badges. So the dating is consequently somewhat vague for Ming Dynasty badges. And one thing that I have learned over the course of the years, much to my dismay, is when you talk about rank badges, you should always avoid saying always, and you should never say never, because there's always an exception to every rule that you think exists. One other set of general comments about Ming badges. In general, Ming badges had no border. They tended to be larger than Qing Dynasty badges, often were somewhat trapezoidal, although not obviously so, but narrower at the top than they were at the bottom. Ming badges did not need to be split because they were worn on red traditional Chinese robes, which were fashioned along the right side. And so the front badge could be shown intact just as well as the back badge. But Ming badges could be split if they were made as part of the robe itself, since the looms at the time were only half a robe's width. And so if the badge was made as part of the robe, it could be the case that not only the front badge, but both the front and the back badges were split. Split badges are usually brocade, but that's not always the case. One of the kind of anomalous things about Ming badges, that animals are often shown either sitting on their haunches or recumbent, as opposed to standing straight. And that kind of detracts from the fierceness that these animals were supposed to portray when they were worn by military members of the Chinese army. The number of rank badges or birds were not specified in the court dress regulations. So civil badges could have as many as 3 birds, and on rare occasions you will find a military badge that has 2 animals on it. I personally have not yet seen a badge with 3 animals, but I never say never. Some interesting blanks in the dress regulations were that the practice of wives wearing a badge was not identified at all. There was just nothing whatsoever about whether or not wives could or should or were allowed to wear badges. Ancestor portraits indicates the wives did wear badges, but ancestor portraits are notoriously inaccurate, and so that should not be considered conclusive. One of the other interesting questions is if wives did wear badges, did they wear mirror image badges or did they wear exact duplicates? The sun disk was not addressed in the Ming Dynasty court dress either, and there's the question of whether or not the sun disk was ever used in Ming badges. But I think the examples that we'll look at tonight will shed some light on some of these uncertainties. And I need to tip my hat to Chris Hall, who has provided most of the examples of the Ming badges that we'll look at tonight. This is one of the earliest Ming badges that I've seen. It's a Siachai, a censor's badge. And again, a lot of times in Ming badges, it's difficult to tell whether or not the creature had one or two horns because of what I call the hairline that had the kind of, I stuck my finger in a electrical socket thing, that all of the badges just have this very straight combined mass of hair. And so in this particular case, you can't tell whether a second horn is hidden behind the mane as it's presented. The way that you can always check on this is to look at the feet, because a Siachai will have paws and a Qilin would have hooves. Both of them had dragons' heads, one with one horn, one with two. And early Ming dragons had very elongated snouts and very prominent nostrils, almost crocodilian-like. That changed over the course of time, and later dragons had more of what we consider a dragon appearance and less appearance of a crocodile or alligator. The things that are in the background, I am inclined to call clouds only because I know the clouds will eventually show up there, but these really have no, they don't really reflect any particular cloud form, and we just might want to consider them a way to fill up the background. This is one of the very interesting Ming badges, one that has 3 birds on it, 3 egrets in this particular case. But in this case, we have the representation of the 3 elements of the universe, and that is the water shown down here at the bottom. Although the flowers appear to be randomly placed on the badge, if you look closely, you can trace the badge stem down to a thin line of land here. And now we have, again, more stylized versions of things that we might want to call clouds. So in this badge, we have the first start of the 3 elements of the universe: the sky, the land, and water. This is an interesting badge. It's a brocade badge, and it's split, so it was obviously made as part of the original robe on which it was worn. The clouds now are starting to form the 3-lobed shape that we are used to seeing in clouds. That's a reflection of the sacred mushroom shape and invokes a certain longevity for the wearer of the badge. This badge continues to have this single mass of hair as mane and tail. And we know that this is a Qilin in spite of the fact that we can only see one horn because it has hooves and the scales of a fish. The land mass is indicated by these triangular little mountains on the side, and the water is represented by the waves at the bottom. This is another Qilin, obviously very different from the previous one. This one is very much more colorful, still has the single mass of hair for the tail and the mane. We're starting to see things that we can kind of, let's say, look like clouds now up in the sky. We have very small mountains at the corners of the bottom of the badge, indicating that land mass is there. And then, of course, the water represented by the waves in the middle. One of the things that we probably ought to note here, it reflects on one of the questions that we had about whether or not wives wore badges, and if so, were they mirror images. The last 2 badges are both Qilins, but other than that, they really have no connection with each other. But when you look at them side by side, it's interesting to note that the postures of these 2 animals are identical to those that would have existed if a noble had worn a badge similar to a military badge, and that is the body was pointed toward the left, toward his wife, but the head was pointed toward the emperor to make sure that the official didn't lose his head. And we have a mirror image of that positioning on this badge. And so this is a relatively strong indication that wives did wear badges similar to the husbands, but at least in some instances, they wore a mirror image badge, not an exact duplicate of their husband's badge. This is an interesting dragon badge, but indicates the difficulty that I have in telling the age of the badge. The dragon is so dominant, it covers almost the entire area of the badge. Since he's face on to us, we don't see the crocodilian extended snout of this particular dragon, but we do have the mountains in the left, center, and right at the bottom. We now have waves and spray from the water hitting the mountains. We have the water here and the clouds in the background. And we know that this is a very senior lung dragon because it has 5 toes. This is another dragon, obviously in much different color palette. One of the things that I find striking is that the flames associated with the mythical beast, in this case, are blue in order to keep the color palette in this particular design consistent. And again, we don't see the elongated snout of the dragon because it's facing us. Clouds are starting to look a little more cloud-like in the upper part of the badges. We still have these straight-edged mountains in the corners and in the middle, with the water shown as relatively symmetric humps in the bottom. One of the things that is innovative about this badge is we see for the first time the introduction of wealth symbols. On this side, 2 rhinoceros horns, and on this side, a gold ingot. But that's the first time that wealth symbols were introduced into this sequence of Ming badges that we have tonight. This is starting to look more like what we tend to think of as a rank badge. The clouds now are obvious. The cloud forms in the spiral pattern, multicolored because multicolored clouds were good luck. We still have the very single mass of hair for both the tail and the mane. And this, again, is a psyche because it has claws. We have now the mountains taking a little more rounded shape than the more flat-sided ones that we've seen before. The innovation here is, in this particular badge, the introduction of the fungus as a kind of a reflection and duplication of the cloud designs that you see above it. We also see in some instances the clouds coming to a very sharp point at the edges, and that will become a characteristic that we'll see in much later emperors' reigns. This is another interesting bird design with 2 cranes involved in it. Again, we have now a very asymmetric and convolved landmass on either corner, an interesting representation of the water and the spray. And in here, the land is represented not only by the mountains, but the flowers that are associated in the background of the badge. But here, the flowers aren't rooted at the mountains. Their stems just seem to go off into the side of the badges. And we see, again, the combination of the spiral pattern and the cloud patterns and the sharp point toward the inside of the badge. This is a very interesting bear badge. The innovation here is that we have an entire land mass that is supporting the bear, as opposed to him just kind of standing kind of precariously on the top of the mountain in the center. The, the water is also represented in a little different way, with the water mainly associated only in the right bottom corner here. The clouds now are becoming just bands of color in the back and the top, but we still see the sharp pointed interior of the badges, and also the spiral design that has continued since we first saw identifiable clouds. One of the interesting things about this bear is that it no longer has that single mass of hair, but it starts to have a little jagged edge here, and it has a little more character to the mane, and the tail is also kind of jagged in that way as well. This is a very interesting badge that kind of presages something that will come several hundred years later in the form period. And this is just a simple badge with birds and clouds. Again, the clouds are seen as bands of color with the spiral design on the inside. And since there's no other iconography, we just recognize this very simple design of the two egret badges. This is another double bird badge, interesting in a couple of ways. Number one, this is a badge of a princess because it has phoenix on it, as opposed to one of the regular rank birds. We are still seeing the spiral design of the clouds, both at the bottom and at the top of the badge. They still have the sharp pointed edges on the interior part of the clouds. One interesting thing about this is that the male-female relationship in this badge is inverted. The male phoenix is here resting on the rock, and the male is supposed to be a representative of the yang force, the active, aggressive force, but the male is shown resting on the rock, which is kind of an interesting divergence from the way that's normally portrayed. The female phoenix is the one that's shown in flight, and it's also interesting that she outranks the male badge, the male phoenix, because she has 4 tail feathers, and the male phoenix only has 3. So this may be a very subtle way for a Ming princess to indicate that women are not always subservient to men, in spite of what the culture of the times might have been. This is a very, very unusual pair of badges, and this kind of puts to rest any question about whether or not wives wore badges and whether or not they wore mirror image badges. This is a pair of qilins, obviously a male-female pair. The male would have been on the right, and the female on the left. It's a very, again, in my experience, unique pair of male-female badges of the same rank and exactly the same design. One of the things that we saw also in the Phoenix badge is that the landmass now is 2 diagonal masses of land that occurs in the corner of the badge. It's another Phoenix badge. This is a little more gender neutral. Both of the badges are male because they have an odd number of tail feathers and have serrated edges on their tail feathers. But this is a brocade badge and indicates one of the issues that can happen when a badge is made on 2 different looms, and perhaps in this particular case by 2 different people. although the design is meant to be symmetric and identical, you see that the color palettes in the leaves up here are not in fact consistent. The color of the phoenix's bodies is different. And although the water design matches exactly with respect to the height, the colors are obviously significantly different. And so this is just an interesting anomaly that can occur when the badges are made on two different looms, and I'm suspecting by two different people. These badges still have this diagonal sloping multicolor landmass in the corner of the badges. This is a most unusual badge. It's the only badge I've ever seen that is a military badge that has two animals on it. Both animals are shown on their haunches. They're bears because they have sharp edges at the end of their manes and tail, as opposed to curls. Very colorful badge in that particular regard. And the bear was considered a mythical beast. And so we have the red flames associated with both of these animals here. Again, we have the thing that appears to have been consistent in all of the very late Ming badges, and that is the representation of the land as these two multicolored slanting pieces of ground that support the animals or the birds. This is another dragon badge. It's interesting, the difference in the color palette. As I indicated, the robes on which Ming badges were worn were red, and the artist and or the official who wore this wanted the background of the badge apparently to match the red of the robe. So we have a background red, which required, again, the flames to be shown in blue so that they would contrast with the background color. We have, again, the symmetrical cloud water at the bottom and the multicolored diagonal land masses on the edges of the badge. This dragon is a somewhat low-ranking dragon because he only has 4 claws, so he's a Mong dragon, not a lone dragon. And our final Ming badge addresses the final question we had is whether or not the sun disk was used during the Ming Dynasty, and this indicates that the answer is an emphatic yes, but also indicates it was only done very late in the dynasty. The thing that we'll see carry over into the Qing Dynasty is the sharp points on the edges of these clouds and the wavy edges of the clouds as indicated here. The water is still shown as circular and symmetric. The land still shown as these diagonal, multicolored pieces of ground. We do have something that will also appear in Qing badges, and that is wealth symbols on either side of the rock. And that kind of covers the number of Ming badges that I have to share with you tonight. We now go to the Qing Dynasty area and some general comments there. One of the differences between the Qing and the Ming badges is Qing badges had borders where Ming badges did not. They were generally smaller than Ming badges and more square than trapezoidal. The badges were adopted to wear on a short riding jacket, which fastened down the middle. And that's an acknowledgement of the nomadic cavalry nature of the Qing Dynasty's forces. But that necessarily meant that the front badges were split in order to accommodate the opening of the jacket. But some back badges, like Ming badges, were split as well if they were made as part of the jacket itself. The loom width, again, was only half the width of a jacket, and any badge, pair of badges that was made as an integral part of the jacket would have both badges split. The wives were explicitly authorized to wear a badge, but they were required by regulation to wear a badge identical to their husbands, but that requirement was largely ignored. If a wife wore a badge identical to a husband's, her bird would have looked away from her husband, kind of turning her back on him. And that was so appalling to the cultural sensibilities of the time that wives most always wore a mirror image badge. And the sun disk was quickly adopted in Ming badges, although military badges were slower to adopt sun disk than were civil badges. One of the interesting things that we'll see in one of the early badges is an implication of the fact that the Qing court regulations were only published 8 years after the Qing Dynasty occupied Beijing and claimed dominance over the country. Up until the publication of the Qing court regulations, the Ming customs were largely followed. And we'll see one very interesting implication of that in our second Qing badge here. Qing animals are shown standing upright. There's only one very late Shunzi badge that I'll show you that shows a Qing animal in a Ming pose. The size of the Qing badges varied considerably, but not necessarily in the way that conventional wisdom would have us believe. But contrary to conventional wisdom, the sundisk was rapidly adopted as opposed to only being adopted in the mid-1700s. Wives wore badges very early in the Qing Dynasty, as they did in the Ming, and the sundisk did not represent the emperor. There are two theories about the representation of what the sundisk represented, both of them promulgated by Professor Schuyler Cammon, who did most of the early seminal work on rank badge scholarship. The two theories were that the sun was the emperor, and that's why the birds and animals looked at the sundisk to show their respect. The other thesis was that sundisk referred to a Chinese saying that said, if you set your goals as high as the sun, you will be successful. The Chinese generally represented that by aim at the sun and rise high. But if you will notice as we go through the Qing badges, the Qilin, which in the Ming Dynasty was the rank badge of the first military rank, does not look at the sun. And nobles badges, the ones that have dragons in them, do not have a sun disk. I would hypothesize that the reasons for that is the only way that a general or a noble could rise high is if he replaced the emperor, and indicating aspirations to replace the emperor was a good way to cut your life short. One other thing that we'll see, not tonight, but in the next presentation, is that counted stitch on gauze badges were introduced in the Qinlong Emperor's reign, not in the mid-1800s. So the Shunzi emperor was the first Qing emperor. He took the throne as a 6-year-old child when there was a dispute about who should be the first Qing emperor that served in China. This is a golden pheasant badge, and we'll note that unlike the later golden pheasants, this golden pheasant has 3 tail feathers, and we'll see that exists not only in Shunzi but also in Kangxi. This is a wives badge, and the sun disk is clearly here. And so our first example of a Qing rank badge is a female badge and a badge that contains the sun. And so that kind of dispels those two issues right away. We see, as we saw very late in the Ming Dynasty, a limited number of precious things on either side of the rock. We have the kind of straight-sided mountains on either side of the rock, but now we have what's known as a scholar's rock, a rock that had holes in it that supports the bird. Also, the shape of the water has changed, and we see this kind of asymmetric that has a sharper rise toward the rock and a lower slope as it falls away. And that's true on both sides of the badge. And that's a difference between the Ming and the Qing badges. This is a dragon badge, and it's a Mong badge. He only has 4 claws. But what we see is the same kind of cloud designs that we saw very late in the Ming Dynasty, with the cloud formation with the sharp point toward the inside of the badge. We have, though, introduced a particular cloud design that's going to be very important to us in the remainder of this evening's discussion. This kind of, in this case, it turns out to be backward, but kind of an L-shaped cloud formation that has a mushroom shape on the top and this tail with a sharp point on the end. We see the same kind of mountain design here in this dragon badge. We don't have the scholar's rock, but we do have the straight-sided mountains, the same asymmetric kind of waveform. And note that there is no sun badge in this badge, or there is no sun in this badge, because that would indicate that this noble was trying to replace the emperor. This is one of the interesting anomalies that I believe occurred because Ming rules pertained early in the Shunzi period. Let me talk about the badges in general and then address the difference in the size. We have here what I consider to be the kind of a quintessential Shunzi cloud design. You have a very wavy edge to the clouds, and at least one end of the clouds, in some cases both ends of the cloud, end in a sharp point. And the clouds have proliferated throughout the badge. And those are all what I consider to be quintessential representations of the Shunzi period. You have rhinoceros horn and pearls on one side, and it's never clear whether this rolled up item is a book, a painting, or a roll of silk. In any event, all of those are valuable objects and serve as wealth symbols. We also have a gold ingot that is placed up here and a pearl as ancillary and additional worth symbols. Now let me address the difference in sizes here. If you recall, the Ming regulations had nothing to say about family badges. They only specified the rules for the officials, both military and civilian. One of the characteristics of the Qing army was that it was hereditary, and every able-bodied male who belonged to a Qing banner, and that was every male, Manchu male in China, because the banners were both social as well as military organizations, was expected to be a soldier. And the oldest son, if he met the physical qualifications, would expect to inherit his father's military rank when his father left service. And so it was possible for the eldest son of a Qing officer to know what rank he would hold when he became of age and took over his father's position. And since there was no prohibition for a son to wear a badge identical to his father's, the only hypothesis I've come up for the existence of this smaller badge over here is that this was a son's badge that was made by his father to remind him of his future responsibilities as an officer in the Qing army. And it was done at a time before the Qing regulations were published, and the wear of badges by children was prohibited. Now, an alternative hypothesis is this badge on the right might have been made for just a very small officer, but that's contradicted by the fact that there was a minimum height requirement. You had to be at least 5'6" tall in order to be an officer in the Qing army, and so you wouldn't have that size difference if both people who wore that were adults. And as an interesting sidelight, the badge on the left is in my collection, and the badge on the right is in Chris Hall's. This is an interesting Shunzi badge. Has the same wavy edge clouds that associate with Shunzi badges, sharp points on either edge. We have a gold background now that seems to be a plain gold background, not pattern. But that apparently was an individual idiosyncrasy because the gold background will come and go during the Shunzi period. What's interesting, and we'll see in the next two badges, is this introduction of this interesting and kind of questionable, I mean, there's no real obvious reason for these horizontal lines intermixed with the clouds. We have the same representation of the mountains in the corner, the Scholar's Rock in the center, and the asymmetric waterfalls. These horizontal lines now appear to have been incorporated into the cloud design themselves. And we see that the white lines and the pastel colors have been included in the cloud designs themselves. We see the same wavy edges, the same pointy ends on the clouds that indicates that this has a close relationship with the previous clouds. But we do have this interesting striation now that has been incorporated into the cloud design. This is a male badge, and so the presence of the sun disk is not a surprise. What is interesting is we're lacking the mountains on the side, but we do have the Scholar's Rock in the center. Obviously, this is kind of an idiosyncratic badge done by somebody who really wanted to make sure that you knew he was authorized to wear a mandarin duck. And so the mandarin duck, just covers almost the entire area of the badge. This is a continuation of the striation design that we saw in the previous badge. The white and blue stripes alternately mixed in the cloud design, but the same general form with the wavy edges and pointed ends. Here we have the mountains included in the design again, and the Scholar's Rock. The water here is more symmetric in some instances than in the normal Shunzi badges. It's only in these outer edges that you get the asymmetry that we have been seeing. The gold background, again, is not patterned. It's just a complete woven gold background. This is another peacock badge, another badge done for a female. And incidentally, this is a brocade badge. It's one of two badges, and both badges are split, which indicates that these badges were made as part of the robes on which they were worn. This has the traditional shunzi, wavy edges, pointy edges on the clouds. But one of the innovations here is this particular cloud form, which we will become very familiar with when we look at the Kangxi badges. But this is an early harbinger of one of the cloud designs that's going to become a major part of the rank badge design in the next emperor's reign. And we see that formation represented down here on the bottom, with the other clouds in this L-shaped form with the cloud with the mushroom shape on the top and the pointy edge down on the base. The asymmetric cloud design, water design, and the mountains on either side in the corners, and the pierced scholar's rock supporting peacock. This is our last Shunzi badge. And again, note that we have a continuation of the design that we saw first introduced here. The same wavy edge, pointed ended clouds, the mountains shown as before, the L-shaped clouds still in prominent positions in this badge. This is the only Qing badge that I've seen that shows an animal sitting on its haunches. So this is kind of a unique and unusual badge for that particular period. We'll now move on to the Kangxi Emperor. The Kangxi Emperor was the first real emperor that ruled on his own. The Shunzi Emperor, as I said, took over when he was 6 years old. He died of smallpox when he was 24, and he had barely started to act as an emperor before he died. The Kangxi Emperor also was crowned as the emperor when he was 6 years old. He, however, served with a complete cycle of 60 years. He had an early difficulty with his regents, but he and his mother managed to outfox them, and the Kangxi Emperor became known as one of the most effective emperors in Chinese history. We see here the same kind of a sliced C formation that will become quintessential to the Kangxi period. The L-shaped clouds in subordinate positions in the lower part of the badge. We don't yet have the gold pattern background that is probably the most recognizable characteristic of Kangxi badges. But we do have the straight-sided mountains on the side, the asymmetric water forms at the bottom, and the pierced scholar's rock that also supports the landmass that this qilin is resting on. Notice that this again is a qilin. The qilin is not looking up. There is no sun badge on this, or sun disk on this badge. This is what we kind of recognize as a Kangxi rank badge. Vibrant colors, large birds, and a unique gold background. The gold background is patterned so that it's almost like the colors, the colored part of the badge was kind of dipped in liquid gold. And what you see are the ripples that came out in liquid gold that surround each of the elements of the design. So it's a very intricate way of laying out your gold design. It also makes sure that the sun catches the gold and sparkles, no matter which direction the sun's shining on the badge. We have the traditional Kangxi cloud forms with the L-shaped clouds in subordinate positions, the sun disk here, the mountains, the water, and the Scholar's Rock are all very similar to what we've seen before and what we'll see in the remainder of the Kangxi period. One of the things that is probably not evident in just a picture of a Kangxi badge is that most Kangxi badges have a kind of a three-dimensional feel to them. In some cases, that was exaggerated by the use of bamboo splints and padding that went underneath the embroidery that actually comprised the bird and some of the clouds. In one instance, I saw a Kangxi badge that was in somewhat deteriorated shape, and some of the threads on the pin feathers were gone, and you could actually see the bamboo splints that were used to give a Kangxi badge kind of a third dimension. It's another peacock, very much similar to what we have seen. We note that the sun is still distinct and different from the cloud formations. The cloud formations are exactly what we have seen before. The pattern gold in the background, and the mountain, Scholar's Rock, and asymmetric water are all the same. It's another peacock, very similar to the one that I've shown, except for the way that the tail feathers have been treated, much more colorful way of dealing with that. The asymmetry of the water forms are much obvious and much clearer in this kind of badge, but the same cloud formations, the same L shape, the same cross C, same pattern gold background that we're used to associating with the Kangxi Emperor. This is an egret badge. Things are starting to change here, and things change very slowly in the Kangxi period. I believe that that's because the Kangxi was the first real emperor that the Qing Dynasty had in China. And what I think he was trying to convey with his badges is a sense of stability and a sense of impressiveness. And I think that's why the badges are so aesthetically pleasing. The colors are bright, vibrant. You have a gold background. It's a very almost intimidating way of showing your rank. And I think that the slowness of the design changes and the impressiveness of the appearance of badges were just designed to say to the Han Chinese that we're in charge, we're here to stay, and this is a stable institution. We have the traditional Kangxi cloud form, but here now we have the sun incorporated into this cloud formation that would normally have been the mirror image of this cloud formation here. It's one of the small changes that was made in the Kangxi period. The clouds now are starting to become a little less common, a little sparser than they have been in previous badges. Here's a really magnificent representation of a Qilin, who's the first military rank. The sun has been included in this cloud form like we saw in the previous badge. This maintained its traditional shape, and notice that the Qilin is not looking at the sun. Mountains, Scholar's Rock, asymmetric water are all standard Kangxi designs. one of the later innovations in the Kangxi period was to represent the birds in circles. Two reasons for that possibility. One is it allowed greater symmetry, and bilateral symmetry was kind of an important artistic characteristic been brought over from the Ming Dynasty, and that allowed the design on either side, as you can see, to mirror each other. So it was almost like a mirror image inside the badge. The sun is still a part of this particular cloud thing. The other reason for representing the bird in a circle was a reminder of people that these were officials closely associated with the emperor, and the emperor at that time was the only one allowed to use the circular iconography. And so this was just a reminder that these people were very close to the emperor. This is the female version of the badge that we just saw. The only real difference is the sun has been moved in the other corner. All of the other design characteristics are the same, but indicates also that mirror image female badges were worn very early in the Qing Dynasty. This is a peacock version of the cranes that we have just seen. It's a female badge, a circular design in the center, the sun included as part of the cloud formation over here, and the regular quintessential Kangxi cloud formation here with the L-shaped clouds in subordinate positions in the lower part of the badge. Here we have a very late period golden pheasant. We note that even in the late part of the Kangxi period, the golden pheasant had 3 tail feathers, not the 2 that are normally associated with it. It still has a patterned gold background. The sun is incorporated into this cloud. We have the traditional positioning of this cloud formation at the top and the L-shaped clouds in subordinate positions at the bottom part of the badge. The Leopard Badge is indicative of one of the few changes that took place, this one very late in the Kangxi period, and that is we've lost the pattern in the gold background. The gold now is just a simple horizontal weave, simplification of the design, but we still have the traditional cloud formation here, the sun incorporated into the cloud formation here, L-shaped clouds in the bottom. Notice that since the leopard was not a mythical beast, he wanted to have cloud or fire on his badge just like all the other guys, but the fire does not touch his body because the leopard is not mythical. This is the badge that you might want to think was done early in the Kangxi period because we're back to a pattern gold background, very strong asymmetric water formations, very straight-sided mountains in the corners. But this was done actually very late in the Kangxi period. And there are 2 ways to tell that, one of which is obvious here, and that is that the L-shaped clouds now have replaced that cross Z shape that we are used to seeing in the upper corners of the badge. That only occurred very, very late in the Kangxi period. And so you know without doubt because of the cloud formations here that this was done very late in the Kangxi period. The other way that we know this is done late in the Kangxi period is its size. I think it's generally well known that the Yongjin badges, which follow the Kangxi badges in chronological sequence, were the smallest badges in the Qing Dynasty. But what is not as well known is that shrinkage in size started well inside the Kangxi period itself. What we have here is this last peacock badge shown superimposed on the circular crane badge that we saw about 5 badges earlier. And you can see the significant reduction in size that has occurred within the Kangxi period itself. The Yongjin period would continue that shrinkage, but we need to recall that was a continuation of a trend that was first started during the Kangxi Emperor's reign. And our final badge shows the final way that badges were modified in Kangxi period, and that was to make everything gold and only have the rank creature stand out in bright, vibrant colors. So here we have this very gorgeously colored mandarin duck in the center, with everything else just kind of fading into the background, including the L-shaped clouds that have become the dominant form of the clouds. There is one version of this kind of badge that shows the L-shaped badge tail kind of tending off into an obtuse angle as opposed to a right angle. And that prefaces a design that we'll cover very early in the next presentation when we start discussing the Yongjin badges. That concludes the presentation for tonight. We now have an unmitigated and totally self-serving pitch for a new book on Chinese rank badges. It's now available on Amazon, but as Bob mentioned, you could also get it from his Jinhing company. And in case you're not familiar with it, the address and phone number are available. And if you get the book from Bob, you don't have to wait for it, and you can shave the shipping costs. And so the book is also available from the publisher, but I'm not quite sure why you do that if it's available from Bob and Amazon. But in case you're interested, you can get the book shipped from Hong Kong. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience and time, and I will turn this back to Bob and let him conclude the program.
Oh, wait a minute.
Okay, I should be back.
Wait a minute. Oh, okay. Tell me, are there any questions, Felicia?
Let's see. There is one from Annette Dre. You indicated an odd number of tail feathers indicated a male, yet we saw examples of female badges with 3 tail feathers. Is this a casual rule?
No, the number of tail feathers indicating male and female only applies to phoenix. So the birds themselves have a standard representation, and so a female, and in the case we're probably talking about golden pheasant, would have 3 tail feathers because all golden pheasants had 3 tail feathers at that side. It's only in the phoenix that the number of tail feathers represents the gender. And it's the gender of the phoenix, not necessarily the gender of the wearer. But as we know, odd numbers are male numbers and even numbers are female numbers. And so if you see a phoenix, if it has an odd number of tail feathers, it should have serrated or scalloped edges to the tail feathers. And if it has an even number, it should have curls at the end of the tail feathers, and that indicates whether it's a male or female phoenix. It does not necessarily indicate the gender of the wearer.
Let's see, well, you have a lot of compliments. Someone said, thank you for a fabulous event. Someone says, fascinating lecture. Thank you for such an informative presentation. But you have I guess we don't know this yet, but Dawn Marie Lee asked, may I know when the next lecture on rank badges will be? We don't know that yet, right? Oh, you're making it up right now.
It'll be in February.
Okay. Let's see, there's compliments, wonderful presentation, very informative and wonderful examples. Linda Lum asks, who designed the badges?
There is no simple answer to that. The badges were procured by the individual officials. The emperor authorized an official to wear a certain badge, but it was the official's responsibility and expense to procure his own badge. And so the badges were made throughout the country by a variety of artisans with more or less guidance and direction from thousands of different officials on how they wanted their badge to look. And so that's one of the reasons why you always avoid always and never say never, because the variety of designs and the variety of the personal desires of the artists and the officials who were wearing the badges just varied so widely and varied over such a long period of time. So it was a collaboration between the individual and the particular artisan who made the badges. And as an aside, two things that might be of interest. One is that most of the badges were done by men or young boys. Women, that would have been a profession for a woman, and that was frowned on culturally in that particular time in China. And so the badges were made mostly by males. And there also appeared to be levels of badge shops, so that somebody who was buying an exalted crane badge would not have to rub elbows with somebody who was at the lower end of the bureaucracy buying a quail. And so there seemed to have been three levels of shops, one for what's called the senior ranks, the crane, golden pheasant, and peacock, one for the middle ranks, from the goose to mandarin duck, and one for those who had not passed the actual examination process, but had been a successful chief clerk in the district magistrate shop, took a simple examination and was entered into the bureaucracy at the 9th level. So 8th and 9th level people were generally people who had not passed the examinations and were considered second-class citizens. And of course, guys who had gone through the rigorous examination process didn't want to be associated with them. So there seemed to have been three levels of shops run by men doing individual badges for individual officials.
Okay, so
and Felicia, excuse me, and if I may, I make the same offer that I've made before, and I haven't been deluged, but I have received a couple of responses from each lecture. My email address is just my first initial and my last name at AOL.com. So if somebody on reflection comes up with a question or just something they want to ask about rank badges or something, please send me an email at dhugus@aol.com, and I will be happy to respond as best I can.
Okay, Kitty asks, will the next webinar on rank badges include an explanation of embroidery techniques?
The answer to that question is no, because I don't know much about them. It's a funny thing. One of the reasons I got interested in rank badges is my wife was interested in crewel embroidery and needlepoint when we were first married. And so if I need any help on identifying whether or not the badge was woven or embroidered or something, I go to my wife. So I don't know much about embroidery techniques. I just look at the designs.
Okay,
But-
Chuck Wu. Oh, sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
But the embroidery techniques, I think, also are an indication of the age. Isn't that true? That there's a much wider variety of needlework in the later periods as opposed to the earlier periods.
Yeah, Bob, I believe that's true. My particular thesis on that is, here's fact. We know that the design of rank badges got frozen in mid-Guang, and all the badges started to look exactly the same. And I believe in order to provide a little variety and not to be just one of somebody who's wearing a badge that looks like everybody else, you had a proliferation of media. So you had more counted stitch on gauze, more embroidered, more metallic badges, more monochrome brocade badges in the mid 1800s after the badge design had for some reason become frozen in the Daoguang period. And so it's true that there is a wider variety of techniques in the mid 1800s and later. I think it's just a result of a stultification of the artistic dynamism of China as the Qing Dynasty and the imperial system went into its fatal decline and death.
I'm wondering, is the richness of the earlier periods in their design and technique, is it also a question of what survived, or because earlier textiles are rare?
There is a theory that Kangxi badges used so much gold thread and peacock feather because the silk industry had been damaged by the Qing conquest of the southern provinces. I have a tendency to question that thing based on two particular points. Number one, at least two of the major silk producing cities surrendered without resistance to the Qing forces, and therefore they would not have been damaged at all. The second thing is that the use of gold and peacock feather existed throughout the entire 60-year period of the Kangxi Emperor's reign. And even if the silk industry had been damaged in the conquest, you'd think that over a period of 60 years that it would have recovered. But you don't see any major shifts in the materials that were used in the Kangxi badges. And so that's a theory that has been put forward, but one that I don't find totally attractive. And we'll see. And the next thing, as soon as you get out of the Kangxi period, you have a radical departure from the materials that were used in the badges. The size continues to shrink. The borders go away for a while, and there's essentially no gold in the background at all. And that was an abrupt change from the Kangxi Emperor to the Yongjin Emperor. That change was so abrupt that I have to believe that it was driven by the personalities involved. Kangxi is considered one of the better emperors in Chinese history. One of the problems is Kangxi Emperor believed that himself. And so the badges in his reign reflected what he felt was his own magnificence. The Yongjin Emperor doesn't get nearly enough credit, in my estimation, from historians. He was probably the most dynamic, the most hardworking, and most effective emperor, clearly in the Qing Dynasty, but perhaps throughout dynasty. And one of the reasons that his reign is so short, just 13 years, is he worked himself to death for the Chinese people. He only slept from midnight to 5 in the morning. When he had been emperor for about 12 years, he fell ill because of exhaustion. His advisors pleaded with him to slacken his pace and take more time for himself, and he refused and ended up working himself to death in the next 3 years. And so he was very dynamic. He was not all that merciful, but he was very self-effacing for an emperor. And you see this radical change from the personality of the emperors involved, mirrored by a radical change in the appearance of the rank badges. And so I'm more inclined to believe that the rank badges of the Kangxi and Yongjin periods reflected the personality of those emperors, as opposed to being driven by any limitation in the materials that were available.
Okay, here's a question from Chuck Wu. For civil rank badges, civil official has a bird facing the sun on the left, and the female badge would have the bird facing right. For the badge position on the back of the robe, official and female bird would look opposite of each other. Does the badges on the back of the robes need to have the birds faces facing each other?
Thank you. And if I'm remembering, Chuck Wu was one of the people who took advantage of my last offer, and we had a discussion about male-female badges, particularly on military badges. So thank you, sir, for your continued interest. The badges on the back of the robes were identical to the badges on the front of the robes. I mean, if you've ever had a pair of badges, you would know that to be the case. I didn't show any pairs of badges because other than making that point, the second badge doesn't tell you anything intellectually that the first badge doesn't. But I can tell Mr. Wu without question that the front and back badges differed in the Qing Dynasty, only with one being split and the other generally not being split. But he's absolutely correct. Both birds would have looked away from each other when a man and wife sat next to each other if you approached them from the back. My suspicion is protocol probably did not allow people to approach a man and wife in a social event from the back.
Okay, here's a question from Dawn Marie Lee. David, do you know of recorded instances of civil ranks being conferred to overseas Chinese in exchange for a donation to the emperor? This is what we are told of Straits Chinese merchants in Southeast Asia.
Yes, I'm not particularly familiar with that process with respect to overseas Chinese, but it was in fact done within China itself. So I imagine that it also included overseas Chinese. In various parts of Chinese history, one could in fact buy the right to wear a badge with a philanthropic donation. In the Han Dynasty, it was generally a gift of grain because there was widespread famine at the start of the Han Dynasty. It's because the Qing Dynasty had so much managed the country that's why the Han Dynasty exists. It was a peasant rebellion against the Qing Dynasty, and so early in the Han Dynasty, you could buy the right to wear a rank badge, not necessarily hold an official position, but wear a rank badge with donation in grain. Later, donations of money were also acceptable ways to wear a rank badge. Very, very late in the dynasty, after the two Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the loss of the war to Japan in 1895, the imperial finances were so constrained that the sale of rank badges became very widespread. So depending on the period of history that you're talking about, the rationale and way of being able to purchase the right to wear a rank badge varied, but it occurred from very early in Chinese history in the Han Dynasty all the way through the end of the dynasty down to when Puyi was emperor for 3 years.
Well, I think that's all the questions.
Well, in that case, I want to thank David for a wonderful lecture, and I'm really looking forward to the next 2 lectures that he's going to be giving us. We will send out a bulletin announcing the date and the Zoom location. I also want to thank Felicia for doing a wonderful job, and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California and the Textile Museum Associates for co-sponsoring this program. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you again. Perhaps you can spread the word that we're going to have I think an extensive teaching of rank badges during this series. And I also want to let you know that these programs will be available on YouTube. And I guess I should also plug David's book because I think it's a wonderful book, and the appendices I think are a wonderful, short, precise history of the Qing Dynasty. And just by looking at it for the last 30 minutes before the program, I was really fascinated. And I say this not because I'm selling the book, because the book is priced very, very reasonably. And the reason why it's priced very, very reasonably is because the retailer is making almost no profit. And the profit that I will be making from sales from you people will be donated to the China Society. So I'm saying this because I think it's a wonderful book. Anyway, we look forward to seeing you at our next couple of meetings. And I want to thank again, David, and thank all of you for coming to watch. I think we can say good night then.
And thank you, Bob. And please recall, if you have questions later on, please email me. I mean, anybody.
Mhm.
Thank you.